Hello, and welcome to Good Grief, the podcast dedicated to demystifying and destigmatizing grief with compassion and humor. I'm Nikki. I'm an end-of-life doula and a grief coach in Columbus, Ohio. And today I have yet another special guest episode. Before we dive into that, a couple quick things. I have no idea how this is going to sound until I start editing, but I'm recording from a slightly different location today. We've been having record-breaking temperatures all across the world, really, and it is a level of hot that I can't describe in words, and my office is upstairs, and it has just been unbearable. So I am down in my basement, and it's a little louder down here, so apologies for a slight difference in sound, but I wanted to get this recorded. I wanted to get this out here because I was very excited for this episode. I had a great conversation with Carol Hamilton. She is part of the Feminist Podcast Collective, and she had just the most wonderful story she wanted to share. I say wonderful. That sounds a little rude. I don't mean that people dying is wonderful, but it's wonderful when people are willing to share their stories out there in the world so that other people can feel a little less alone. That's part of why I do all this. So Carol was so gracious to share her story with me and with all of you. And I won't say much else. We'll let you just listen to it. No trigger warnings that I can think of today. I take pretty good notes during my interviews to see if anything comes up that might be upsetting. Obviously, this is a podcast about death, dying, and grief. So that's just kind of a blanket warning, I guess, for this. Also, this is my last show of my second season. I'm a little sad, but hey, I get a little bit of a break, which I desperately need. But thank you guys so much for being here for this part of season 2. And, we'll be back again. I'm only taking a 4-week break in between, so you'll be back. And I've already got some great interviews I've had with some other guests that you'll get to hear in season 3. I cannot wait for you to hear them. Anyway, I have to say it every episode. You can find me at patreon.com/Nikki the Death Doula. I would be so grateful if you would help support me. All the money in my Patreon goes to funding that I can provide pro bono services to those who cannot afford them. So yeah, you can get access to this podcast a week early. You can see the video of my conversation you're about to hear with Carol. And you get grief affirmations and Q&As, all sorts of other great content right in your mailbox or, your email, or, it's on Patreon, but it goes to your email too. Okay, anyway, that would be amazing. For as little as $1 a month, you can help me out, and I'll give you a little shout out on the podcast. And speaking of, shout out to Barbara Mindell, my newest patron. Barbara, thank you so much. So happy to have you here. All right. Now, without further ado, I'm going to shut up and we will get on to this episode with Carol Hamilton. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being here this week. I have another great guest episode. I'm very excited to be speaking with Carol Hamilton. Carol, I'm just going to let you introduce yourself here briefly. Tell us a little bit about you and what brings you to my podcast today.
Yeah, so we're both part of the Feminist Podcast Collective. So excited to be here with you. My name's Carol Hamilton. My business is Grace Social Sector Consulting, and I work with nonprofits and associations, helping them with their strategic planning and evaluation design, all from an equity lens and equity point of view. And what else? So, besides work, I'm one of 5 kids. I'm the 4th out of 5, which I don't think really hardly exists anymore. So I'm kind of a middle child, but I was also the older of the last 2 kids. So some fun there. So sister, mom, grandma, wife, and I don't know, what do you call it when both of your parents have passed? I guess I'm still a daughter.
Yeah, you're still a daughter. Somebody was telling me that when both parents die, you become an orphan, and I don't like that.
I don't. That doesn't feel.
It's not like they did it on purpose, or they couldn't take care. Well, I mean, I guess it's true.
Well, no, and as an adult, right? As an adult, it's very different.
Right. Absolutely.
It does bring you into a different stage of adulthood, though. That's for sure.
Yeah. I'm not looking forward to that day when that comes. My only brother passed away, so it's going to be just me to deal with everything, and I'm going to feel real alone in this world.
Yeah. Yeah.
But also just my husband is the oldest of five, so there you go. It still happens. People do still have large broods of children. My husband is proof. Okay, well, thank you so much. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your story of loss and what you want to share with my listeners today?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was thinking about it as getting ready for this podcast, and I know this won't be released right when we're recording it, but the anniversary of my mom's death is actually next week.
Oh,
11, well, is it? Yeah, 11 years ago. It was her death was very sudden. My dad's death was, much more expected. Um, and and I've often said that they both died as they lived. My mom kind of went out with a big bang. She was a big personality. She was
oh,
small but mighty. And my dad was the quieter one, and he wasn't one for letting go, shall we say. So that was a process.
gotcha.
Um, yeah, but just thinking about that weekend, it was a weekend in July, actually very similar to the weather we've been having. That we were in the midst of a heat wave. And what was interesting looking back on it, some unusual things kind of happened with my mom's passing. She that my parents had a place. I'm in the DC area. My parents had a place up in West Virginia, and they would go there basically for the summer. And almost my entire my entire nuclear family plus spouses and children had gathered up there the weekend right before she died, and I didn't, and including my sister, one of my younger sister, who at the time was living overseas. So I actually met them at the airport. I dropped my daughter off with them, and then they drove on to West Virginia. I stayed behind that weekend because I was in the last class of my graduate program. So I was doing, a master's degree in organization development, and it was my very final class. I was doing that while I was working full time. So every weekend was very precious. It was my last chance to write this paper. So I, stayed behind while everybody was up there in West Virginia. And then I get a call from, I guess, one of my sisters saying that my mom had been taken to the hospital for a heart scare. And
Okay.
this had happened multiple times before, although I think we didn't actually know how many times before. Like, it all came out afterwards. My mom and dad had kind of kept it on the down low. I think mostly because my mom didn't want my sisters to be looking her about
Oh,
whatever was going on.
oh,
And
yeah.
which I can understand. She was a very independent person, and did not like, she liked to tell us what to do, but certainly didn't like being told what to do. So, or anyone worrying about her.
Yeah.
And so it all seemed, like, oh, here we go again. Like, not. I don't think anyone was particularly concerned. And in fact, one of my sisters described her last conversation with my mom being about the fact that she had forgotten her book, and that the next day my sister should be sure to bring her book because she was bored in the hospital. Um,
Oh,
but the next morning she had a massive heart attack, and when they all got there to visit, when they thought it was going to be nothing,
yeah.
yeah, she was already gone. So they call
Gosh.
me at work, and I'm like, I was just floored.
Yeah.
It was so unexpected.
Hmm.
And yeah, so then my middle brother is developmentally disabled, deaf, and autistic. And it was interesting because we had done a lot of planning, or like my parents had done a lot of planning for what would happen after they died, after they passed for him. But I don't think any of us had ever had any conversations about what happens to either of them.
Yeah.
I think we were probably all expecting that my father would go first.
Right.
My mom went first, who really was, she was the one who took care of everything. Like, she ran their life.
Hmm.
Um, that was a big shock as well.
Wow. Yeah, I bet. Oh, so did things get sorted out then with your brother? I'm assuming so, but like,
Yeah,
how did
actually,
that get
things
handled?
with my brother, that in some ways, he's still at the he lives in a group home. He has
Yeah.
for the last now 35 years or so. So that was all, there was continuity there.
Okay.
And it was actually like, what do we do with my dad? That was more of the
Yeah.
question.
Oh no.
And the other interesting thing was, I don't think any of us were particularly, well, at least I'm a Unitarian Universalist. My other parts of my family, well, except one sister converted to Catholicism, mostly not particularly religious.
Mhm.
So, the plan was to have my mom have either of my parents cremated, but then we realized my brother won't know. Like essentially, my mom will just disappear
Right.
unless he sees her and has some concept of the fact, like he's nonverbal.
Okay.
He has very basic signs that are like for the very, basics of do you need to go to sleep? Are you hungry? Basic
Yeah.
life. So there was no way that we were going to be able to explain to him,
Right.
where was mom? And he was used to
Oh.
seeing them on a regular basis. And so we actually had to have the funeral home like prepare her as if there were going to be a viewing, because we had to
Okay.
do a viewing for him, even though I think for the rest of us, we were just like, oh my God, this is the strangest thing.
Yeah.
But um, I can see why, especially not having been there, um, it did make it more real. I see why people do it. I see why
Yeah.
it's a ritual.
Hmm. Absolutely.
And so then we did think about it for my dad, but yeah, that was kind of a
Yeah.
ritual that I don't think any of us had thought about beforehand.
Right. And it's you said you've listened to a couple episodes. I never make a secret. I try not to get on soapbox, but I never make a big secret about my feelings on the funeral industry in the United States.
Oh,
Um, and I don't like to
we totally
generalize.
got suckered. Yeah,
I don't doubt it.
I was in the room, but I let my dad and my oldest sister make most of the decisions. And I kind of just watched how they it was not pleasant because they just
Yeah,
prey on the shock and the grief and
I know.
upsold us on so many things that my mom would have been like, "What? You spent money on what?"
Yeah. Yeah, and I always put the CY in there that not all funeral homes are like
Not
that because
all, not all.
I personally have been to some that are not like that whatsoever. They will not upsell you. They'll give you what you want and that's it. But yeah, when you were talking about preparing her body, like I personally just do not love the idea of embalming, but I absolutely understand why so many people do it, why people want to have viewings. And if you're going to do a viewing, unless you're doing it in 24 hours, you have to do the embalming, right? But there is a sense of closure there, especially in an instance like your brother or somebody who might not fully, understand if you try to explain to them that somebody is dead, to have them be able to at least see it. And I see this with pets too. I always encourage people who are dying to leave their pets in the room. Don't like lock them out of the room.
Mm,
Let pets
mm,
get it. They know. They
mhm,
understand what's going
mhm.
on. Sorry, I'm not comparing your brother to a pet. I
No, I
promise.
understand. I understand.
But just that sense of closure is so important to all beings. So, yeah.
And I mean, we don't really know exactly what he took away from it,
Mm.
but yeah, at least he could see.
Yeah.
And it is, I mean, I don't know. Before you go through this, unless you are in the industry, you like or medical, you have no conception except for what
Yes.
you see on TV. And of course, they're not going to kill the person in order to show them. And
Yeah.
it's so different looking.
Yes.
It's freaky. It's
It
freaky.
is. It is. And that's why, again, for sake of closure, if you need to view a body, I totally respect that. And that's something I carry with me with my brother. That was not an option with him. There was going to be no viewing, and he was cremated. And there's part of me that is sad that I never had that closure of getting to see him, because he died suddenly too, and I never had that closure of, like, I know he's dead. I'm not, I'm not going to
Right,
delude
right,
myself thinking there was a conspiracy and he's still alive somewhere.
right, right.
But just not having that closure of seeing him is always something that's there for me. So I respect people that need to witness their loved one or see them after they've died. So
Yeah, and I mean, we did end up having her cremated, so it was
yeah,
anyway. But it served a purpose. It served a
yeah,
purpose, and because everybody was there, the other thing that felt so weird was, in my faith tradition, there isn't a rush to
mhm,
have a funeral, or
yeah,
oftentimes people will have memorial services. It could be months later.
mhm,
But because everybody was there and they had gathered for that weekend, we really felt like we need to do this before everybody, we need to have funeral, the memorial service before everybody has to go back to go
right,
home.
right,
So that like kind of fed into the whole shock, because and I think this is something that you learn when you go through this, how much like you're going through this emotional process, but then there's so many practical things you have to deal with and have to deal with them quickly.
mhm,
And so that was that week. I don't really know that I remember a ton of it, except
yeah,
my over perfectionist family all sitting around, including some people who have background in theater and production of various sorts, as we're
mhm,
talking through the memorial service, and essentially doing like a run through, like a dress rehearsal. I'm like,
yeah,
guys,
yeah,
and my dad and he was, and both my parents, greatest generation, that
mhm,
very stoic, didn't want to cry. And I'm like, Dad, you were
yeah.
married to her for 63 years. Like,
Oh my God.
you're probably feeling something, but God, no, he was going to make it through that eulogy without shedding a
Oh
tear.
my
He was
gosh.
determined. And I'm like, why? And then I see people standing up at memorial services and funerals and saying, I hope I get through this. I'm like, why? Why do you hope
Why?
you get through it? Like, just
Yeah,
cry. Like, you miss the person. It's okay.
yeah,
You break
yeah.
down.
Preaching to the choir over here. I see that far too often, and I think it's a generational thing. I think a lot of the older generations just have that mentality of you don't show your emotions, you keep them to yourself.
Absolutely.
So I'm glad to see that, and I'm Gen X and younger and everything. We're all a little more comfortable with those emotions. Like Gen X, we're right on the border. Some of us are not
Yeah,
so
I'm on the very first year of Gen X, so I'm still learning about those things we call emotions.
Yeah. Yeah. Me too. I didn't say it was easy for us, but we're at least a little
Right?
more open to the fact of trying to express them.
Open to the fact
Uh,
that they exist, and
yeah, feelings are things and
they
we're
are.
allowed to feel them. Anyway, enough of that. So, how did your dad end up coping with all this? Since I know, like you said, and it's statistically speaking, typically men die sooner
Sure.
than women. So, and that was not how it was anticipated. So how did he cope with all of this?
Well, yeah, and also just because my mom was the one who was the active one, she exercised all the time. She, was paying attention to all that. And my dad basically when he retired, he helped out with my daughter for a couple years, which was amazing, when she was younger. And then after that, he basically sat down and read the newspaper and read historical tomes for the next 20 years. So it really wasn't like, you're like, okay, you're probably, and yet he's the one who lived another 4 or 5 years. So,
Wow.
but yeah, around that time, I have an apartment on the side of our house, and our tenant had just moved out, and I said to my dad, "Do you want to move in just for a little bit?" Like, I wasn't, don't make any decisions, just stay here kind of while you're getting organized. And I knew that he was probably then never moving back to their apartment in the community they lived in. But I also knew that he was not someone who could make a decision quickly. And so, and I did that kind of not really knowing what I was signing up for, honestly. Um, because that seemed a lot easier than having to schlep over to his apartment, which was a
Yeah.
45-minute drive away, to deal with all the things, all the daily stuff. Like, he was perfectly fine physically, mentally, but he was that generation. My mom took care of him.
Mhm.
And he was kind of the absent-minded professor type, and he was in his books.
Mm.
She dealt with life.
Yeah.
So like the thought of trying to figure out how are we going to create all these services around him so that like he pays his bills and gets groceries, like,
Yeah.
the really basics.
Yeah.
I was like, it's easier if you just come live here. I can feed you dinner.
Yeah. I see a lot of that. All of my clients so far as a death doula have been women, and most of them have either been widowed or not married, but the couple that have husbands that were left behind, it was just like that was their worst thing to get over with their own imminent death was
Mhm.
just who's going to take care of my husband? He
Mhm.
cannot, he can't survive on his own. I pay the bills, I do the shopping. I don't know what he's going to do. I'm like, he'll figure it out. We'll make sure he's taken care of. Usually there are kids,
Or
adult
he
children.
has over-functioning daughters who just step in and take over.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I appreciate that. I would do the same thing because I manage everything here. And if I died, I don't know how my I'm sure he'd be okay, but I would worry a lot, like who's gonna take care of him, who's gonna pay the bills. But
Yeah.
I see a
Yeah.
lot of that. It's so true, which is it's a difficult thing to get through for
Hmm.
sure. So
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
what about you? What was your grief journey like after losing your mom?
It was hard because it was so sudden. Um, Although it was funny when my older sister, one of my older sister was, help we were cleaning out the apartment once we finally decided my dad wasn't, or he decided he wasn't moving back there. And she found all these files
Oh,
dating back, a decade or more of Heart Doctor,
oh wow.
stuff that my mom had never talked about. So, it wasn't, it was there,
Yeah.
and I think what we've realized later was that she actually lived a decade longer because all the things she did. She lived a decade
Okay.
longer than both of her siblings. But I that summer I was kind of working my way up to having a kind of an important conversation with her about we had kind of a complicated relationship. My brother, just the impact being the younger sister of a person with a disability, and just the focus and energy that he took from of my parents, and how she prioritized him over everything.
Hmm.
And I'd kind of been working myself up to have this conversation with her, and then boom, she dies, and I don't get to have it. And so that was hard to just like feel that. I also, I didn't see her. Well, I did see her in the show, the viewing that we talked about, but the last time I had seen her, I had gone up a couple weekends before to that cabin, and I slept in that morning, and my parents actually went to another person's memorial service, so they left early. I didn't actually get to
Yeah.
say goodbye, so I literally didn't get to say goodbye. And
Oh.
I had this big thing that I'd been kind of like trying to, build the courage to have this conversation. So for a long time, there were a lot of just kind of loose ends. And so I had to, just work through it. And I think having my dad live with me, I did have a conversation with him and about some things. And it totally didn't go the way I expected it to.
Really?
He was very defensive, and at that point he was almost 92. I'm like, okay, the man's not changing. We're not, like, I've said my piece. But
Yeah.
it helped me kind of reconcile the idea that, when you want to have one of those conversations, you also, I don't know, I think in some ways you imagine getting what you want from it
Hmm.
and what you need from it. And
Yeah.
having had that conversation with my dad, I was like, well, I could have had that. And it could have taken years longer for me to, if ever,
Hmm.
get the resolution that I was actually looking for. And it might never have happened, even
Yeah.
if I'd had the conversation with my mom. So letting go of that um, took a while. And then, I was kind of thrown into dealing with my dad. And so
Yeah.
I don't know. I just, although one thing I definitely did that year, um, she, one of the things that was left in her car was this CD, uh, like a gospel CD of a jazz musician. And my daughter, apparently, like 6 months before, at some point, my mom had said to my daughter, "Oh, I want this song played at my funeral." And so we did. And I listened to that CD like on repeat for the next year at least. And I feel like that was part of just like processing everything.
Wow. So, what was your like journey with your siblings like? Like, how did they handle all of this? And you said you kind of had to jump in and take over some stuff. Were they helping with
Well, I
this?
was, yeah, I mean, I was the one that was local. And we've had a lot of bumps on the road in the kind of aftermath, working with my dad and helping out and all the things. But it was really interesting for me to see how differently each of my siblings grieved my mom, you know, dealt with what was going on with my dad. He was fine for a couple years and then started to decline. Um, yeah, so it was, and just kind of how they each saw their relationship,
Yeah.
because I think you realize that each of you actually were kind of in a different family with different parents,
Yeah. Yeah.
especially with 5 kids, and we were over a span of 17 years, so really big time gap.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that was really, I just oftentimes I just found myself saying, well, that wasn't my experience, or that wasn't my
Yeah.
relationship with dad or with mom,
Yeah.
and just having to kind of do that differentiation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that was,
Man.
but yeah,
I
people who have to do it by themselves, I also started with a friend, started a support group for people who were caring for elderly parents. And honestly, all the ones with siblings had the worst stories, because
I don't doubt it.
there wasn't alignment on, either
Yeah.
how the parent was, what they
Yeah.
did, how to handle things, so many
Yeah.
conflicts, and all the stuff that like was there back when you were kids, like all
Mm-hmm.
gets, I'm sure
Yeah.
you see this with the people that you're working with.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and like you said, like you all had different relationships. I really wish my husband was here to hear this story. His, being 5 children and him and his siblings, like there's a 22-year span with
Oh,
them.
wow.
Yeah,
I
he's the
don't.
oldest, and his youngest sibling is 22 years younger than him. And his mom passed away unexpectedly when she was 55, I think. His youngest was still under 18,
Mm.
her youngest. And watching all of them go through this, because two of them were still living at home.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and they're in another state too. So he's all the way over here in Ohio. They're all out in Connecticut. And, obviously we went back immediately to help take care of stuff and the funeral and everything. But watching all 5 of them grieve this loss very differently was very interesting. But they all had different relationships with her too,
Hmm.
different and all in different places in their life. So it's
Yeah.
yeah, I'm obviously very sad I won't have my brother to help me with these things, but I could see us fighting a lot.
I mean, being as having been a single parent, the silver lining that I found was, well, I just get to decide.
Right? Yeah.
Like,
Well, and I tease my parents all the time. I'm like, you guys better be nice to me. I'm all you got left.
that's right.
I'm the one that's gonna be doing all this stuff when you
Uh-huh.
can't. So be nice.
Yeah.
Obviously I'm teasing.
Yeah.
So
Well, if you had like a piece of advice or something you would say to somebody who has experienced a sudden loss of one or both of their parents, what would you tell them? What would your advice be?
Hmm. I don't know. I'm not much for advice giving.
That's probably good.
Um,
Well, I'll rephrase the question a little bit. Let's say
okay.
there's somebody listening to my podcast, and this is why I do this whole podcast. I'm
Yeah.
hoping that there's somebody out there who's had a similar story and they feel a little less alone. If there's somebody out there who has suffered a similar loss, like what would you want to say to them? Doesn't
Mm.
have to be advice. What would you say to them?
Yeah, I guess for me what helped was whenever I have an issue, I read.
Mhm.
So I read a ton of stuff about, death and dying and just and that helped me kind of go through
Mhm.
it. And I think the most helpful things were actually one of them I think that I remember most vividly is Joan Didion's book about losing her husband and
Mm.
just the way that she described kind of this magical thinking of expecting to see the person,
Mhm.
um, and just how um, the things will hit you at the most unexpected time. And it still
Mhm.
happens, right? Like that song might come on the radio. Not that anyone listens to the radio anymore, but or somehow that might
Yeah.
pop up and that might hit me in a way that
Mhm.
or you know, uh, making her peach custard pie, or actually, my aunt made the peach custard pie. It was my mom who made the rhubarb custard pie. So I made that
Mhm.
summer, and it was very. I wasn't expecting that, 11 years later, that would kind of get me in the gut of like, ooh, yeah, that was mom's pie,
Yeah.
things like that. So
Yeah.
I don't know, the trite things of take your time. It'll it emerges as it does, and
Mhm.
it comes in waves,
Yeah.
and it'll hit you when you don't expect it.
Yeah. And that is so true. And I see that like I experienced that. Everybody I know has experienced that. And my husband too, because he'll have those days where he's like, oh man, I gotta call mom to tell her about and it's been 9 years now since she passed
Right.
away, but he still has those moments where his gut, because he and his mom are like best friends. He called her at least once a week. They chatted on the phone forever. And he always has that gut reaction of I need to share this with mom and he can't.
Hmm.
So yeah, it sneaks up. So, all right. Well, before we wrap things up, one question I meant to ask. What are your parents' names so that we can all honor them?
Maxine Hamilton and Bill Hamilton.
Maxine and Bill Hamilton. Thank you for sharing. All right. So as you know, I like to end my episodes by pulling a card from the death deck. So I will pull one at random and you will answer it and then I will answer it.
Okay.
Oh my gosh, we kind of already answered this question, but here we go. Open caskets. A, help me get some closure with a final meaningful goodbye. B, are fine if that's what the family wants. Or C, really creep me out. I want to remember the person in their living state.
So for me, actually, C.
Yeah.
And when my dad died, I get the call. He had been home for a long time in our house and being cared 24/7, and then was in a nursing home. And I remember that morning they called. It was like 5 o'clock in the morning. They called me and let me know. And then I call my sister, and my sister's local now. And I was like, I think dad died. And she was like, you think? I think they told me. So I go to the nursing home. And yeah, I wish I hadn't seen him. I wish I hadn't seen him like that.
Mhm.
But we were able that time to bring my brother over right away. And so we didn't have to go through the whole, the funeral home was a lot more expedited. So
Yeah. Yeah. For me, I'm kind of in the middle there because if that's what people need and want, I say go for
sure.
it. But I personally don't find it necessary. So, yeah. Now that said, like if one of my parents dies unexpectedly, I will want that closure, wanting to see them if at all possible. If I really can't, I can't. But
Hmm.
I'm not going to push that. Like I said, it was not an option with my brother. Anyway, so do you have any final thoughts before we close out today's episode? Anything else you want to share?
I think, because my dad was not unexpected, and it kind of, it was that thing that more and more people are experiencing of the slow decline.
Mhm.
The treasure that is hospice.
Oh my God, thank you for saying that. Yes.
Before I didn't know, I thought hospice was a place. I
Mhm.
didn't know
Yep.
hospice was a service and a process.
Mhm.
And it was the people involved, just amazing and so helpful.
Yeah. Thank you. Oh my God, thank you for saying that. I preach that to I'm blue in the face. And I just hope somebody hears me that needs to hear that, because sooner rather than later.
Yeah, because I think everybody was really afraid of it. And my dad especially didn't want to kind of admit like that's where we were. But they also said, like, you can graduate from hospice.
You can. And I've had a couple clients that I haven't fought with them on it, because they're going to make the decision. I'm just there to support them. But I've always strongly encouraged them to start hospice, and they're like, I don't think I'm ready. And I'm like, you can stop at any point. I was like, let's just get it started. We'll get them in here. You hear them out, hear what they have to offer, what they're going to do. And then if you decide you don't want it, we can say no, or we can start. And if a week in you're like, I don't like this, we can cut it. It's not like you're held to them till your last breath. So
yeah, and it was so amazing that it's so holistic.
yeah,
That, it's dealing with really basic stuff, like, one dedicated person who would come and help my dad, with bathing and basic stuff like that, to, the chaplains and the volunteers. I mean, they're just all the levels, and them being able to explain instead of me having to explain to all of my siblings, especially the ones who weren't local, who couldn't, be there on a regular basis, kind of what to expect.
yeah,
And having that conversation multiple times with people, I think was so helpful.
yeah. Hospices, yay.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for that and for sharing your story, Carol. I want to give you the floor for a few minutes. Please tell us all about you, where we can find you, your podcast, and anything you want. Floor's yours.
Sure. So if you're someone who works in the nonprofit sector in any way, either staff or on a board, check out my podcast, Mission Impact. We're there talking about nonprofit management and leadership, all to the aim of doing good work in the world without being a martyr to the cause. And my consulting practice is Grace Social Sector Consulting. So you can find me at gracesocialsector.com. And yeah, check me out. Check out the podcast.
Awesome. I'll put links to all that in the show notes, so folks listening at home can just click away to their heart's content. So,
all right.
Carol, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for the work you do.
All right. Another huge thank you so much to Carol for sharing her story. Thank you, Carol. It was so lovely to talk with you. I haven't had a bad conversation yet with any of my guests. We have such a great time. I love chatting with them anyway. Thank you again, Carol. And thank you to all of you, my listeners, for making this podcast what it is. Without you, it would be just me talking at a microphone. So I truly and deeply appreciate each and every one of you. And with that, that's a wrap on season 2. But before we go, if you would do me a solid and leave me a review or rating, that would be awesome. If you're listening on Spotify, you can now leave comments, which is so cool. A couple people have taken advantage of that. It's very isolating doing podcasting, so I'd love to hear from my listeners, and please let me know what you think. You can also reach out to me through my website, nikkithedeathdoula.com. You can also follow me on social media and comment there. I am on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, all at Nikki the Death Doula. So thank you guys so much. I appreciate every single one of you. I hope you have an amazing day, and I'll be back in 4 weeks with season 3. But in the meantime, remember, as always, your grief is yours, your feelings are valid, and grief doesn't always have to suck. Good Grief with Nikki the Death Doula is produced by Nikki Smith of Nikki the Death Doula LLC in Columbus, Ohio. Nikki the Death Doula LLC is for consulting, education, emotional support, and guidance, and is no way considered a funeral establishment or licensed mental health establishment. Scripts, editing, sound design, literally everything with this podcast is done solely by Nikki Smith of Nikki the Death Doula LLC, with the exception of the music. The music is Cheery Monday by Kevin MacLeod. Licensing information can be found at filmmusic.io.